I'm joining you from Bangkok, Thailand, from the Office of Focus on the Global South here. Um, well, I just wanted to make a few points. One is the WTO is in very, very, very serious trouble at this point in time. Um, when it was launched in 1995 and at the first ministerial meeting in 1996, this was supposed to be the organization, that would be the prime engine of corporate-driven globalization. And that was sort of the hype at the time. This was also the time when you had all these partisans and ideologues of globalization basically saying that globalization was the wave of the future. And why couldn't people like us, who were defending people's rights, give way and stop criticizing? Because after all, the best of all possible worlds would be delivered if you just let the market have its way and don't have any protections against the market. Just let the market work out what they called its magic. Well, now we have this instrument of globalization in a in a comatose state. And as Shell has said, there is a desperate effort, especially by the developed countries, to have this 12th ministerial yield something that will show the world, that, hey, it's not yet dead. There's still life left in this. Well, why has the WTO come to this state? Well, there are several reasons for this. Okay, one is this idea of neoliberalism that if you just let the market, have its way and don't have state interventions, don't have popular protections, that if you just let the market have its way, it will create the best of all possible worlds. Well, actually, it has created tremendous chaos. And the biggest disaster, that came from letting the market have its way came in that 2009 global financial crisis, which had tremendous effects throughout the world, and especially in the global north, in Europe and the United States. So basically, what that meant was that this idea that the market knows best was contradicted by events. The main one was the 2009-2010 financial crisis. The second thing that has created this was the overreach of the global north within the WTO. And what I meant by this is one writer said that all empires have their periods of loss of confidence, decline, and fall. What we saw was this period of overreach after the Uruguay Round. The global north, led by the United States and the European Union, wanted more openings from the global south. And this created the collapse of the Seattle Ministerial in 1999, when civil society and the developing country governments, basically their synergy between them led to the collapse of the ministerial. And then, of course, in 2003, the Cancun ministerial also collapsed, because at that meeting, the global north tried to say that, hey, it's not only trade, it is also competition policy. It is also government procurement. It is also investment that should be included within the WTO jurisdiction, and the developing countries resisted that. And what happened was, that therefore this institution that was supposed to open up the developing countries more and more created the conditions of resistance. And there was leadership that was displayed here by South Africa, by India, by China, and this then created the conditions for resistance. And the last time that, at that point, the United States basically said, hey, if you don't want to liberalize with the WTO, we will go out and create our own uh, economic partnerships, bilateral partnerships, multilateral partnerships, and those who join us can join us. Those who don't want to join us don't want to join us. So basically, there was this retreat of the United States away from the World Trade Organization as the main mechanism of liberalization. Now, there was hope in 2013 in Bali that somehow the WTO could produce a sort of agreement and consensus. They seemed to have that when it came to trade facilitation. But after a few months, India basically said, our conditions have not been met, that the issue of permanent solution to public food stock holdings, that there should be a solution on that, and you have not delivered. So the Bali ministerial also failed. And so, as Shal said, there have been no ministerials that have yielded a declaration or a consensus since then. In fact, what has been happening is that the US has retreated more and more into unilateral action. It has practically destroyed the dispute settlement mechanism by blocking judges, because it says that, oh, these judges keep on ruling against the US. Obama did that, Trump did that, and Biden's policy continues Trump's policy. But so basically, the US has moved towards unilateralism, trade warfare, targeting particularly China, and basically has repudiated the whole multilateral system itself. So basically, the WTO is limping along at this point in time. And so you have all these different issues that the DG wants to have some sort of consensus on, like WTO reform, like fishery subsidies, like the TRIPS waiver. And it's not likely that they're going to have that consensus, because the positions of the different countries, the developing countries and the northern countries, are very far apart at this point in time. They might come out with a declaration that has some nice language that seems to reconcile conflicting positions, but they're not going to be creating consensus on any one particular issue. At least that's what I think is going to happen at this point in time. Now, of course, what's going to happen is that a lot of the discussion will be on the TRIPS waiver. And I think that this will be addressed by the other speakers. But on the TRIPS waiver, basically, the proposal of the developing countries, South Africa and India, was a comprehensive waiver on the production, the use of technologies of corporations from the North, not only for the vaccine, but therapeutics, diagnostics, and that sort of technological the waiver on the technologies, so that the global South can be able to produce its own responses to COVID. The positions on those have been very difficult, because the global North, led by the UK and Switzerland and the EU, have been putting all sorts of very tight restrictions on any kind of waiver, so that it's now been narrowed down to just one article, and that this comprehensive waiver has now been narrowed down to be almost useless, as one organization has put it. So that's the situation at this point in time. My sense, and I will end with this, is that the global South should move from the defensive to the offensive when it comes to the WTO, meaning that when the WTO was established via the Uruguay Round, the global South made many concessions that they yielded so much policy space that made any kind of development so difficult, any kind of protection of their economy so difficult, using what they call WTO flexibilities, which really were quite inflexible. So with the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO practically moribund because of the United States, this is the time by which the developing countries can take back that policy space. They can restore quotas. They can take back many of the concessions they made for the agreement on agriculture that has been destructive to their small farmers. So this is the time to really, really weaken the World Trade Organization, so that it no longer becomes this obstacle to development, but becomes really, just a useless organization set on the side. So my sense is take back the policy space that was yielded during the Uruguay Round, and of course, refuse to make any concessions in terms of consensus on any of these major issues. And I really hope that the outcome of this meeting will be an even more paralyzed WTO, because what we really need at this point in time are developing countries and developing country governments and developing and civil society have a situation whereby they can, in fact, create economies that would be able to survive the challenges of this period, if the crisis of globalization. And unless they take back the policy space that they yielded under the Uruguay Round, it will be very hard for them to survive in this post-globalization era.
I think it's very important that we really discuss not just the barriers that we all know exist to a fair global economy, the role of the WTO in creating these barriers, but also, as Walden said, the alternatives, where we should be going now. So I'm speaking from Public Services International, the global union that represents workers who deliver public services. And we represent 30 million workers across the world and their unions. And the majority of those are in the health and social care sectors. And obviously the issues that have arisen around the World Trade Organization during the pandemic are particularly important to our affiliates, our members. And I think this is a really great discussion in the topic here. I know that the Director General of the WTO has been talking about the road as well, the road ahead for the WTO, and talking about the speed bumps or the rocky road that lies ahead to try and adopt new decisions. And she's called for, the potential to come out with three outcomes or as a great target. But I think her road is, as Walden said, a bit of a desperate one, and instead the idea of looking at what could be the end of the road for the WTO and alternatives instead that civil society and workers should adopt is important. Well, let me first say a little bit about the waiver that Walden mentioned, because of course we've been campaigning to back in the TRIPS waiver for the last 2 years, or almost 2 years. well, before it was proposed, this was, of course, something that health workers around the world said need to happen. It makes sense. I don't think it's particularly radical, that if we had all said that at the beginning of the pandemic, I think it was very obvious that what was required was immediate access to medicines and vaccines, to treatments, that there should be no barriers. Every possible barrier to addressing the pandemic should have been prioritised. And instead, of course, what we know is that these rules, these trade rules, were immediately enacted to prevent access to any kind of, not just vaccines, but treatments and methods or even technologies that were posing a barrier that were needed to address the pandemic. At this meeting, I think, of course, there is going to be a final discussion about the proposed waiver. Now, it really, in the end, doesn't matter what happens, I think. It wouldn't even matter if they did adopt the original waiver, which won't happen, and we'll probably see a really watered down version. But the reality is that 2 years later, if that's how long it takes the WTO to contribute to a crisis of this level, of an unprecedented crisis, then I think we can agree that they're entirely irrelevant at the least, but clearly very harmful. So, well, what's clear is that, as Walden said, that developing countries quite some time ago realised that they'd signed on to a set of rules that were deeply harmful to their interests, but particularly harmful to their ability to address a health crisis. And that was clear during the HIV crisis, when a number of developing countries said, well, what we really need is the capacity to produce generic medicines. And that's where the idea that they needed flexibilities around these rules emerged. And yet, despite already the discussion and that this should be possible, we're now 2 years down the track, and everything that we warned that could happen if these barriers were put in place has happened. So a number of new variants have emerged, and the world has continued to face vaccine apartheid. And so I think that we can, what we really need to do is ensure that the WTO has no role in health policy, that it cannot play any role in determining who gets access to any forms of health products, whether they be medicines, vaccines, treatments, information, data. And we need to have a permanent fix that actually doesn't only look at a global pandemic, but that recognises the right to health, and that there should not be trade barriers, or nor should there be any impact on health policy from trade rules within the WTO or within any other trade instrument. But at this meeting, there's even more, I think, that's threatening. And of course, this is one of the major issues. But there are a number of other new issues that a number of countries are proposing and seeking to extend the role of the WTO beyond its existing mandate, and doing that in a very anti-democratic way. So with the Director General's support, there's attempts to bring in issues that don't have support, so that are not consensus. And she's been talking about moving away from a consensus-based decision-making, because they clearly can't get through the agenda that they want, and moving to allow for new issues to be emerged just through a coalition of the willing, and then having further votes to adopt some of those. And some of these new issues are those that big corporations have been calling for some time. So big tech, of course, wants new rights to control data and to ensure that they're not limited in their agenda by any countries. Of course, this is not only about them being able to expand around the world, but it's about ensuring that governments don't limit even their capacity to collect data that's important for the public good, that they're ensuring that they can monopolise data but never have to release it, don't even have to keep it in the country, don't have to provide algorithms. And these are the kind of rules that big tech want the WTO to adopt, that they've been able to push through in other plurilateral venues, like through the comprehensive and progressive so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And at the same time, they're also pushing through rules around domestic regulation. And this is really incredibly anti-democratic, saying that big corporations should have the rights. They want rights as if they're citizens to be consulted on any policies that governments adopt that they think will impact on them. And this is about domestic regulations, which by definition should be the democratic purview of governments to be able to introduce regulations. And yet we have this group within the WTO forming an alliance around domestic regulations that would really constrain the policy space we need. And at the same time, they're calling on the WTO to address issues like environment and climate, that we know the agenda won't be about taking action to actually address the climate crisis, but instead opening it to the market. And we've already seen cases brought at the WTO to stop countries from trying to develop a domestic industry around environmental products like solar production. And we've had cases that says, no, you have to, stop your industrial policy and instead import those. And so I think from our perspective, from PSI, because we, of course, are concerned both about decent work for workers who deliver public services and labour rights, but also about the quality of public services and the potential and the capacity of governments to develop those public services and ensure that they're not privatised. And we see that the WTO's role has been to undermine both of those elements, undermine workers with a race to the bottom and deregulation of the workforce, and undermine public services by delivering greater power to corporations and ensuring that there's an agenda of privatisation and liberalisation across the world, not just in the rich countries. So I agree with Walden's final comments that this could be the moment, I think, that civil society and workers and others can come together and say, enough's enough. The one thing I think that the WTO has done by holding up the TRIPS waiver, by blocking it, has been to expose the agenda and get a broader audience raising concerns. I certainly know that our affiliates, many of whom didn't really have an interest in the past in trade policy, have taken an interest this time, understanding, this can't be right. We can't possibly have to leave decisions around who gets medicines and vaccines to the market. And so I think this is the right time to galvanise both civil society and governments to try and deliver a better agenda, a fairer agenda for all. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again for inviting me.